Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube with another episode of Gaming Outside the Algorithm, a gaming news solocast that strives to focus on gaming news, its economic and technical context, and where it references gaming industry history. This is episode number 2 on Christmas, for those of you who celebrate December 25th, 2025. And for my friends from other faiths, happy Hanukkah, joyous Kwanzaa, and warm wishes on winter solstice. Today, we'll be discussing the EA shareholders giving the green light for the acquisition by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, or PIF, PlayStation's surging Gran Turismo 7 numbers, and new mini GeForce RTX cards on the way from Colorful, typically a Radeon vendor, and I'm sure a lot of other stuff. The show will start in just a few moments. Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, rounding out the year with yet another episode of Gaming Outside the Algorithm. This is episode number 2, because believe it or not, industry news continues to unfold. And so the first news story in the rundown tonight, is this news story over on Video Games Chronicle by Andy Robinson. EA shareholders greenlight $55 billion takeover by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. And I quote, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund will own 93.4% of the Battlefield publisher if it clears government scrutiny. Electronic Arts' proposed sale to Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund has been approved by the company's shareholders. The $55 billion takeover deal was approved in a shareholder vote on Monday. The takeover will now require approval from government regulators to be finalized. Should the acquisition be approved, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund will own 93.4% of the EA Sports, Battlefield, and Sims publisher. Silver Lake Partners, an investment fund run by a U.S. private equity firm, will own 5.5% of shares. So let's dig a little bit more into the financial makeup of that deal specifically. The financial details of the deal are as follows. $36 billion of that will be in equity. $20 billion of that will be in debt. And of course, as you're always going to have with acquisition mergers, well, more specifically acquisitions of this type, you're going to get a little bit of variance in the numbers that get reported because of the different way people round off when they're doing news reporting. That includes a 25% premium for shareholders, and I think that's an important factoid. It's a thing we need to look at and consider when we are looking at things like the Netflix, Warner Brothers, Paramount love triangle, and when the details of that financial deal makeup come out. Because the big question is, what is that premium that's being offered to those shareholders in both offeror deals, if any? Specific to this deal, David Ray wrote about this a couple of months ago, echoing some of the sentiments that I've voiced in the intervening months. Now, Ray is currently the CFO and COO at Lusa, a next-gen game development platform and engine, specifically focusing on tools enabling implementation of procedural generation, intelligent debugging, and natural language design. He's had a long, career-long worth of experience in venture capital, private equity, and in the video game industry as well. And so what I would expect us to see out of this is a tilt in what comes out of the greenlighting process. And I've talked about this a few times on the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast. And so the greenlighting process is the means by which the gaming industry traditionally exercises governance by financial and P&L leadership over the creative process and project execution. What must happen by definition, based on the structure of this deal, is that when this deal goes down, is that $20 billion in debt, which I believe will be owed to JP Morgan, I think, must be repaid, and done so within the terms and conditions that are agreed to by Silver Lake, the Saudi Arabian PIF, and I can't remember what the third party is. Oh, and JP Morgan. I don't know why I wrote Silver Lake twice. And on that note, I believe that this is also the assurance that will be offered to the FTC and anyone else who is exercising regulatory oversight. When we talk about some of the concerns that have been raised by Congress on the control of an American media company by a foreign entity. If you go to the VGC article, you'll see several senators who have voiced that concern. But I think that that the investment group putting this deal together will offer up as assurances that, look, we have JP Morgan involved, and so if there's any concern, should a default occur or some other legal action need to be taken, because remember, when mergers are approved, that doesn't mean it's a final done deal. The FTC does reserve the right to come back and undo some of those deals. Yes, it is incredibly difficult, but it is not impossible, and it has absolutely been done before. And sometimes additional clauses are put in, like additional divestitures are requested to be made, or some other tweak is asked to be done after the fact. In this case, there could be an unfolding a scenario where assets would be asked to be reverted back to JP Morgan Finance, and then JP Morgan would preside over disposition of those assets and IP to other, and I'm pretty sure at that point, American corporations and companies. So it'd be really unfortunate for things to go down like that. I don't think it's good when you have a THQ type of incident, or to a lesser extent, an Embracer type of incident, where IPs and studios are taken to the chop shop and distributed kind of willy-nilly all over the place, depending on who ponies up the most money. Sometimes you get bad situations where an IP and the studio that was behind it gets separated. It's never good. I was a big fan of the original THQ before they were dissolved, and that was not a good scene. At any rate, I feel pretty sure that what we won't see is another Sea of Solitude, Lost in Random, Unravel, and maybe not even another Kingdoms of Amalur or a game from Hazelight Studio. In past history, EA has had things like the EA Partners Program, EA Originals, and the EA Creator Network initiatives that have provided investment capital to back studios that made a successful pitch to the board to get financial and publishing backing for their title, which could include things like marketing and other support. And to me, that is part of where the is this good or bad for the industry really comes down to. For a few years now, there has been a discussion coming out of post-pandemic GDC events, and of course GDC will now be called the GDC Festival of Gaming, and probably in a few years people will start asking, what does GDC stand for? And the answer will be, it doesn't stand for anything. It's just an old acronym that now is applied to this other thing. But there's been discussions coming out of there about how the landscape of financing game development has radically changed. And I think that conversation is really significantly more important than the down with exclusives, your games need to be on every platform thesis. That volume started about the same time that these talks were being had about how the financial landscape has changed in terms of how games are funded. And there was no discussion of that at all. It was all about, oh, everybody wants to put their games on every platform, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, okay, there's 0 to 100 of content coming out of GDC, and there's a discussion about this very little skinny lane that's taking place out there, and no coverage from the mainstream gaming media about these other things that are going on, which is why I think, unfortunately, gamers wind up being uninformed about the industry. We need to take a good, hard look at how game development gets financed in a time when much of the venture capital, investment equity firm backing has been eroded from traditional finance pipelining. And then with respect to this deal specifically, what it will mean when yet another potential financier is taken off the table. So you have things going on at Ubisoft, you have things happening at EA, you have a lot of the investment funds, people with that capital who have been in and around this industry before and have been part of the total makeup of available funds that were made to independent developers to get their game made. And that has been significantly reduced. In the meantime, you've had an explosion of games that has happened in terms of the inventory that's available. I think what you're seeing is those 19,000 games that are published on Steam, 7,000 games that are published on console. You're seeing a lot more of those come to the fore with less financial backing. That means I think you're getting games of lesser fidelity. And what we absolutely don't want is E.T. the extraterrestrial cartridges in the desert type of situation where we have a lot of low quality games being produced that confuse consumers, that black out the sun, so to speak, which is already a problem. Discovery is already a problem. The over inventory thing is already a problem. The reduction in quality is already a problem. by the same token, you have a smaller and smaller percentage of games that are making 65% of the revenue. Top 100 new titles making 91% of the revenue that's available on Steam from new games that are published. So you have an incredibly a very high risk appetite in the gaming industry, in at least parts of it. You have then a fist tight risk aversion in other parts of the industry, and it's all swirling around into in a dynamic that I think at the end of the day is not really good or not really great for gamers. So, like I said, what I think will happen with this EA deal predominantly is you'll see EA participating less in terms of a publisher that you can go make a pitch to get your game made. And so at the end of the day, you're going to have, and that's, like I said, in that spectrum of 0 to 100 of quantifiably available funds, you're going to have a reduction of that. And I don't really see in this time and space, in this economic environment, in this fiscal environment, that any other corporation is really going to step up and fill that void. So, do you have less games being made? Maybe. Do you have less games? Do you have more games being made with less financial backing? Maybe. Neither one of those things is really good. So we'll see how this goes. I think what it does do is, people who are huge fans of Football Club, people who are huge fans of F1, those are things that seem to be very prevalent in Saudi Arabian culture. So again, culture does not always beget business, but I think you should be relatively assured that those things are going to get made. And then if you're obviously fans of kind of the big tentpole sports franchises that make the vast majority of money for EA, I mentioned Football Club already, but then also Madden, and now college football seems to be part of that formula as well. You should feel relatively assured that those things will get made as well. Okay, next news story in the rundown is 007 First Light has been delayed by 2 months, now arriving in May 2026. This news story over on WCCFtech.com by David Carcassole. IO Interactive had one final holiday surprise for players ahead of the release of its next game, 007 First Light, a delay. The studio announced that the game has been delayed by 2 months and will no longer release on its previously announced release date of March 27th, 2026. Now it will launch on May 27th, 2026. The news came in the form of a statement shared on the game's official social media accounts where the studio writes, "As an independent developer and publisher, this decision allows us to ensure the experience meets the level of quality you players deserve on day one. The game is progressing well and is fully playable from beginning to end, so these additional 2 months will allow us to further polish and refine the experience, ensuring that we deliver the strongest possible version at launch. We're confident that this sets 007 First Light up for long-term success, and we sincerely appreciate the patience and continued support we've received ever since we revealed the game. We look forward to sharing more updates regarding 007 First Light in early 2026. So, kind of dug around. The first thing that I was curious about was what else is releasing in May 2026. Not much. There is a game called The World of Magic, Rise of Magic, which ships on May 25th. That is from the studio Ice Dragons, which is a new studio only launching, and that game is only launching on PC. Nothing on it yet, really. But their little trailer on their Steam page has like an orc speaking a few lines of dialogue, and a note that says gameplay is supposedly coming soon. That team, as far as I can tell, has not shipped anything before, and again, that game is only coming out for PC. Then there's The Relic First Guardian, which comes out on May 26th, which by the developer's own definition is a Souls-like, which is coming out for PS5, Xbox Series X, and PC from a studio called Project Cloud Games, which, as far as I can tell, is a new studio started up by Perp Games, which is a South Korean publisher. That publisher has a few games under its belt, maybe 10 to 12 or so. The majority of them are above average to good games by Steam community reviews. But that game is going to appeal to some people. It's not going to have like huge mass market appeal. Definitely not anything rivaling the James Bond license. Then, of course, 007 First Light comes out on May 27th. And then Lego Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight comes out on May 29th. So it's kind of sandwiched in between The Relic First Guardian and Legacy and Lego Batman Legacy of the Dark Knight. So no big threats. Probably a good chance. I forgot to check the date. I assume those are the dates going into the Memorial Day weekend here in the U.S. And actually, I will just quickly check. That is the week going into. Oh no, actually, it's the week following Memorial Day weekend. So interesting that they didn't get it out before. Usually, there's a big game, out for Memorial Day weekend for people's 3 days off. Typically, you find one studio, developer, publisher that tries to capitalize on that. So interesting that it's coming out the weekend after. But no major threats that I can tell really in the month of May to that 007 release date. Now, granted, admittedly, right now, the slate is pretty loosely formulated for 2026. And so we could have some more games emerge as that slate congeals and people stop playing it so close to the vest. Actually, I would have actually thought that release dates would kind of be falling off the trees at this point. Now that that there would have been kind of a land rush to secure real estate on the release slate calendar and fill the void that Grand Theft Auto 6 has left. But it seems like studios are still playing it pretty risk averse. It will make it then doubly interesting when Xbox takes the stage in January for its developer direct, as it will be the first major publisher show of 2026. Kind of curious to see whether or not they will lock down release dates and strike at this opportunity, or if they'll be conservative and we'll see dates like 2026 without a season even so much. 007 First Light is on a thing called the Glacier engine, which has been upgraded to now support multiple platforms and support IO Interactive's desire to do concurrent development to release simultaneously on those platforms. Before we get into a little more discussion about the Glacier engine, it's also important to note that 007 is not the only game IO Interactive is working on. They also have a project called Project Fantasy that is currently in the works. Project Fantasy is, quote, an ambitious new IP poised to redefine the online fantasy RPG genre for console and PC. And so the secret sauce of Glacier is really this part of what we call CI/CD in the software development world that doesn't get enough, or really doesn't have a lot of volume around it because people tend not to do it. And so when we talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery, what we don't really talk about is this third piece that's called continuous deployment. In most software engineering circles, you will hear about CI/CD, or more commonly CI/CD pipelines, which stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery. So let's do a really quick primer. In the old days, you would deploy an application by taking source code, compiling it into an executable, and then manually deploying the application to a web application server, and then you would often connect it to a database. A lot of those steps would be done manually, and moving further to the left in that workflow, then a person would go through assembling the different modules of the code, and that would be done by a single person. I always had it done by like a specific belly button who, if something got broken or something messed up, I just had one person, right, to have a conversation with instead of a bunch of people with their fingers in that pot. And I would refer to that person as the build master. Today, we template the code assembly and tag the various components under a version control schema in a repository, or what we call a repo. And we write scripts or jobs that go through the repo, assemble the correct modules of code, and then conduct a battery of automated tests to yield a build. In CI/CD and where we refer to those processes in that discipline, we call that DevOps, or development operations. We often leave out, like I said, the third piece of the formal definition of DevOps, which is then continuous deployment. Typically, we still have some manual intervention step between CI/CD and then actually pushing that code to production, and we don't allow that just to happen in an automated manner, fully done by a machine. Glacier supposedly realizes this additional piece and allows the developers to, quote, change, update, and edit all aspects of the game experience while the game is playing across all platforms and consoles, and everything is real time, instant export, update, play, and stop. It accomplishes this using a WYSIWYG UI, or a what you see is what you get UI, and also hot reloading everything at any time and every time, and an automated asset pipeline. A quote from their description of the Glacier engine's capabilities: live updates across platforms, changes made in one place, e.g. on a PC development environment, update simultaneously on all target platforms, PlayStation, Xbox, iOS, etc., allowing for instant cross-platform testing and debugging. Now, they've been running on Glacier 2, the second iteration of that engine, since 2012. The first iteration of that engine was built in 1998. And what they have elected to do over the last decade is, rather than move on to a Glacier 3, they've elected to heavily modify and upgrade that engine, like I said, rather than do that entire ground-up build. Glacier 2 was a total ground-up build. So they built Glacier 1 in 1998. They ran on it for a little bit over a decade. Before 2012-ish, they started work to build an entirely new engine that would fulfill their needs and meet them for future generations, and that's what they're still on today. So at any rate, my personal hopes are pretty high for 007 First Light. I've been very positive on the game's premise, and it's something that I would definitely be interested in playing. It's not quite open world, but it has large interconnected sandbox areas. That's how IO Interactive describes it, and that kind of provides a similar feel to an open world. So as an Ubisoft stan and a fan of games of similar ilk, I'm very interested and hopeful that this game sticks the landing. Of course, part of the problem for 2025 is that we have the blight of Mind's Eye on the landscape, which was the first external studio game published by IO Interactive, as it tries to find its way as a publisher and kind of find its sea legs and get those underneath them. That's not a very good look. Of course, Mind's Eye is built on UE5, Unreal Engine 5, and it wasn't IO Interactive themselves building on top of Glacier. But as it is today, what I'll call it is it's a keeping my fingers crossed stance on the premise of 007 First Light for right now. Of course, Glacier and much of what IO Interactive does, and what it sounds like they are building Project Fantasy towards, leans in the direction of open world, games as a service, living world types of game structures. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what they do with the world of 007 once it's built. I can definitely see a repurposing for an online game where you have operatives for operations for worldwide operatives from different agencies, and in-world missions that you get sent out on, the ability to work with other agents, for agents to go rogue, for operatives from different countries to cooperate, as well as fight against each other in PvP. But of course, it could also just be kept separate from IO Interactive's other ventures and used for the next Bond sequel. So we'll have to wait and see. All right, let's go on to the next story. Okay, for the next news story, I wanted to talk a little bit about Marathon, finally. I think pretty much every content creator has talked about this game other than me. So over on Windows Central, an article by Brendan Lowry, former Bungie director, says Marathon didn't stem from Tarkov or extraction shooters. It was inspired by an MMO my parents played 20 years ago. And I quote, given that Bungie's upcoming Xbox, PC, and PS5 sci-fi FPS shooter is itself an extraction shooter, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its main source of inspiration came from established and popular entries in the genre like Escape from Tarkov or Hunt Showdown. According to the game's former director, however, this actually isn't the case. Ex-Bungie executive Christopher Barrett, a longtime developer at the studio that majorly contributed to Halo, Destiny, and Marathon before he was fired last year due to a dispute over complaints of inappropriate workplace behavior, has revealed that the original idea behind Marathon actually stemmed from an MMO my parents played 20 years ago, Dark Age of Camelot, or DAOC. I have fond memories of watching my family enjoy the acclaimed 2001 title when I was a kid, and even dabbled in it myself a bit when I grew older, but I haven't heard it mentioned by anyone for years. Thus, to learn that it was primary inspiration for Marathon came as quite a surprise. After reading why, though, I immediately understood. Quote from Chris Barrett, the original inspiration was not Tarkov or extraction shooters, it was Dark Age of Camelot, a tense living world experience filled with co-op player stories and the potential danger of other players, wrote Barrett in a post on social media. Extraction was just a convenient mechanic leveraged to create a roughly 15-minute game loop where players in the same session have multiple opportunities to succeed or fail. So if you go to Twitter and see his actual post, Barrett goes on from there to then discuss other elements of his original design concept, and there are several that elicit thoughts on the potential of Marathon, which may be things that we will see and some we may not, given the game's divergence since he was fired from Bungie. Some of those also popped into my head because I am currently revisiting Destiny 2 with new characters and attempting to run the available legacy campaigns and catch up to present day. And so I'm going to go through some of his bullet points and some of his kind of mini design doc that he posted on social media. This isn't every single one of his design points, but it is several of them. His first one, Living World, focus on emergent dynamic events, long tail aspirational content, and evolving player-driven content. What this makes me think about is the public events in Destiny 2, with where you would have some type of alert system or a map icon to advertise that there was a thing going on or about to happen that you could jump into if you hurry up and gear up fast enough. Player-driven content could be available strikes or raid-like events that could be triggered by a squad or meta squads working together, and that could then also be joined by others. So if you kind of think about public events and how you have that, I think it's a call to banner or something like that, where you can kind of trigger it, and it sets off kind of an alert or announcement or something like that that other players would notice and then could join. His next design point: focus on player stories, PvE encounters, survival, teamwork, exploration, discoveries, and a unique experience every run. What this makes me think of is potentially thematic seasons, small adventures of multiple missions strung together, culminating in a climactic end game with rewards? Question mark. And so these were some of my thoughts that popped into my head as he read his design doc. We'll get to what's going on. I wrote these up before I went fishing for information about Marathon, and we'll talk about that whole dynamic and kind of how I approach new games that are coming out and games that are really in the zeitgeist, which is mostly that I don't pay attention to them a lot. I'll explain that later. His next design point: survival elements like broken limbs, leaking air tanks, mental paranoia, ensuring every run creates unique player stories and clever adaptation leading to success or failure. My notes on this: in Arena Breakout Infinite, one of the key prep dynamics is how you decide to mix and match the different kinds of heals. Larger kits allow you to address broken limbs, but take up more space, limiting your total available loot capacity. Smaller health packs give more space, but a broken limb leads to permanent debuffs if you can't fix it, if they cannot be splinted. Pain relievers help, as do first aid kits, but they don't fully heal. And worse, exerting yourself with a broken limb can actually lead to more damage over time. And the randomness of encounters and dealing with contingencies yields campfire-style stories and the tales to tell after. So if you've ever tuned in over the last, I'd say, couple months to the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast, where I've been talking about Arena Infinite, it's a great game just in that it's just one of those games that, like, you just go into and just chaos erupts. You get particularly when you get paired up with a rando, you don't know exactly what that person's going to do, and you just kind of come away with it with these, like I say, campfire stories that you can tell about the adventure that you had and all of the kind of crazy stuff that went on. His next design point: a narrative-rich PvP competitive game featuring deep lore, corporations, and an evolving story with mysteries to discover. So to me, this is probably the biggest deep thought trigger for me because it relates to what I see going on in Arc Raiders right now. There's a very contentious push-pull between the community forces of those who wanted a Destiny 2-like PvE experience versus those coming from a more more EVE Online seal clubbing mentality. And I don't know, but that dynamic working itself out may be the thing that determines if the game will have staying power or if the fracturing of those forces will cause the game to break as a going concern. In EVE, the solution to this became player-organized corporations, alliances, small companies, gangs, etc. to a lesser extent. And those corporations have even given rise to wholesale cartels made up of multiple corporations banding together to lead an incursion, insurrection, offensive, or other player-led initiative. Some of this is in the very early single-cell organism kind of uprise now in Arc Raiders, and I'm interested to see how much further it progresses. So if you're familiar with the history of EVE Online, it's a very brutal game. Like you matriculate through kind of the early levels, which is a significant amount of time. And then I can't remember because it's been so long since I played. I'll just call it, let's say, maybe level 30. You get to a point where you kind of have to break out in order to go after rewards that are significant enough to allow you to continue to progress, and that causes you to have to kind of go outside the safe zone. Now, EVE Online and I believe Star Citizen have the same kind of mechanism where there is a zone within which you can have some level of adventure, and there's not necessarily, I can't remember EVE Online. I think it's Star Citizen. It's not that PvP is discouraged. It's that or is not possible or is not permitted, but you will get penalized for it, right? You will get bounties. You will be cited for a crime. Formalized, like, law enforcement forces will come after you, things like that. So it doesn't pay to really, like, engage in PvP inside those safe zones. And I think EVE kind of has a similar structure, or maybe, like I said, it's been a while since I played. Maybe you can't even, it's just not possible. But the point is that after a certain point, you have to go out beyond those bounds, and outside those bounds, there's no law. There's nothing to prevent you. This is why I use this metaphor, which I didn't come up with. Other people use it, called seal clubbing, which is just that, like, it's just brutal. And the way people came to contend with that universe in EVE Online was people started banding together. Um, and after a while, it just gave rise to these large corporations, large scale organizations. And so with EVE Online, it's like there's no point in playing that game beyond that level after you have to go outside that safe zone unless you like sign up, right, and enlist with a corporation or some other large scale organization. His next design point: seasonal aspirations and resets built into the core game design. My thoughts: I don't normally like the idea of resets in an online game, but in a game like this where one group can become OP and can just never be caught, I'm more inclined to give grace if this happens. And I often say that a key element for a gas game's longevity when it is PvP or has a very heavy PvP element is that it has to facilitate a means for inviting onboarding that does not immediately turn new players off. And resets is one way to do that. His next design note: partnerships and collaborations built into core aesthetic and content strategy. My thoughts: I'm guessing this was intended to be a metaverse play. Lots of things in this world and the gameplay context make sense. I could see a Running Man or even, get this way back call, a Logan's Run content play. But please, the Schwarzenegger Running Man if you're going to do that, not the Edgar Wright remake. Now, it should be understood. So here, I'm going to get into a little bit about like why I haven't commented on Marathon and I haven't really paid attention to Marathon. So it should be understood that I don't pay close attention to games until they get closer to launch. I'm just not one of these people who gets like super thirsty over game trailers and grade showcases and has this lengthy dialogue about like, what a thing looked like versus like what it comes out like. To me, it's all about games when they show up, when they get delivered. Delays happen. I'm not one of these people who like takes time off right when a game when a game's release date, launch date is announced because it's likely to change. So again, it should be understood that I don't pay close attention to games until they get closer to launch. I just don't believe in expending a lot of my time and pitting hopes and dreams to a thing when delays and major changes are likely. We're in a comfortable window now, and so I'm actually willing to start reading about Marathon. To date, it has just been a line item on my watch list. So with that, let's run down a basic fact sheet of the game. Marathon was a trilogy that existed on the Mac in the 1990s. This reboot will be $40 at launch, which will be sometime now in March of 2026. That is a month that 007 First Light just moved out of into May, which creates even more competitive space for Marathon. And now I didn't get the time to go and pull threads on what else is releasing in the month of March to see exactly what Marathon is up against. So we'll probably talk about that in a later episode. On pricing, Bungie says, and I quote, "Purchasing Marathon will give you full access to the game, including a roadmap of free gameplay updates as the year progresses." Bungie said, "This will include new maps, new runner shells, events, and more, starting with the exploration of UESC Marathon's Cryo Archive in Season 1. The developers have also confirmed that the game's reward passes will not expire, meaning there won't be any pressure to grind through them." So what I like about this is because, again, another game that I've been revisiting and spending a lot of time in now that I'm kind of getting back to gas games and PvP is Halo Infinite. And so this is taking a page from Halo Infinite's book. And so what occurs to me is like, just imagine, amazing world, what an amazing place gas games would be if this kind of became the norm, right? If persistent battle passes that you paid for, granted, but then could activate or deactivate at whim and weren't time constrained to grind through them. I think there's a feeling that those time constraints, those seasonal end states for battle passes drive FOMO. And but the truth of the matter is too, though, that if somebody doesn't complete them, then why would they come back? And I wonder how many more players you would keep engaged if once a person had paid for a thing, they always had a reason to come back. That could be a hook that could potentially get you a longer tail in terms of customer lifetime value that an individual player contributes, rather than constantly banking on the FOMO of people feeling forced and compelled to grind to complete the battle pass on a timeline. The background of Marathon's story is that humanity attempted to settle Tau Ceti 4, but that went sideways and the colonist population is gone, mysteriously disappeared. All that remains are runners, which are cybernetic shells that human consciousnesses were transferred to. The runners are mercenaries, picking over what remains of Tau Ceti 4's resources and available plunder. And in that context, like the entire colony wasn't transferred into runners. It's just some subset percentage of whatever the total population was. The total population was 30,000. So there was, however many runners, wind up people buying the game. The game structure will be oriented around seasonal content, which will also expand on its narrative construct. There will be 4 maps at launch, with a 5th area accessible as some kind of seasonal endgame. There will be 7 classes and 3 factions to take your jobs and missions from. So there will be 7 classes of runners, which is a thing that I'm not totally particular about. That apparently is a thing that that I think Barrett did not want, but that has been injected since he has been moved on by people taking over the design of the game. I'm actually not a super huge fan of hero shooters and would prefer a more open wheeled system where your class was based on what gear you assembled, which is kind of how I feel Call of Duty works once you get to the point where you can make custom loadouts. They do have some loadouts that are kind of tagged and labeled as kind of classes. But after that, it's kind of create your own class based on your gear ups and perks, and that's the way I prefer for it to work. Bungie, and then you'll have 3 factions, which will be the people that you can take things from the job board. Bungie has promised an array of missions and accommodation for different types of gameplay styles, meaning you won't always be ratcheted in hardcore PvP in order to extract, see what I did there, some level of enjoyment out of the game. So I think that's an important element, and I've kind of talked about that when I have commented, the small amount that I did comment on Marathon, but actually more so in terms of Arc Raiders, is that you have some people who are going to love the PvP element, but if you're like in an Escape for Tarkov, and that's kind of feels like that's it, or at least that's what's advertised, or that's the image and perception that people have about the game, that it's all about PvP, then you're not going to attract anyone that isn't interested in that hardcore PvP. And so I think you have to have ways of having other activities, other objectives, other mission types, other things that pull in people who are the PvP element, who want to play co-op, and some way to make it a game that's about more than just seal clubbing, or you've got a max theoretical player base of whatever EVE Online's is, and I'm not sure exactly what EVE Online's is, but obviously these days we don't talk a lot about EVE Online. It's a going concern. It makes great money. Those developers, I can't remember if they're in Norway or Finland, maybe Iceland, some Scandinavian country, but those developers are doing fine. They're going to, but they're not in the zeitgeist. Nobody really talks about EVE Online at volume, as far as like being a revolutionary, innovative thing, and in a voice track that is at a volume that attracts large numbers of new players, right? Which is something that Marathon will need to accomplish. There is no question that the strong launch of Arc Raiders, and maybe to a lesser extent the slippage of footing in Call of Duty, has led to a window of opportunity for extraction shooters, and more specifically Marathon, that I would not have predicted 6 months ago. And if you heard things that I said 6 months ago, you would know that I was not very up on the business premise of extraction shooters. I felt like I said, that they were things that were advertised like for the hardcore, and so they had a max ceiling of the number of players they were going to attract. But even I haven't been enticed to onboard to a few, including Delta Force, Arena Breakout Infinite, Arc Raiders, and I need to check back into Escape from Tarkov, which I bought a license to in early access, but never really played, other than going into like the menus in the UI and like setting up my character initially. But my point is that Arc Raiders has lit a small fire that has attracted other people, including myself, to check out this. I guess I'm getting to a point where I'm going to start calling this a genre. I'm very big on, for instance, feeling that Battle Royale is not a genre, it's a mode, and that's what it should be, a mode within a larger scale game. But I may be at the point where I have to start admitting that extraction shooters are a game and a genre, or at least a subgenre within itself. It's an interesting time in the landscape of first-person shooters and PvP, and I'm excited to see how the wheel turns in 2026. Okay, that's all I've got on Marathon. Let's go ahead and wrap things up with the last segment. All right, last segment for this Christmas Day news show episode of Gaming Outside the Algorithm. I didn't have time to script this out or write an actual longer post about this, so I'm just going to be going through these on the fly. Story reported earlier this week on Sunday over on Push Square by Sammy Barker. Sony's never experienced this phenomenon before. PS5 smash it, Gran Turismo 7 getting stronger over time. Let me go ahead and put it in reader mode and get rid of all those ads. The trajectory of virtually every game, even wildly successful live service ones, is that they'll start strongly and slowly tail off. We're not writing anything revolutionary here. This is a trend practically everyone is familiar with, and we see it all the time with the data made publicly available by Steam. In fact, there's nothing really wrong with it. Games released, they enjoy a few weekends of peak popularity, and then they slowly fade away. The really good titles take longer to drop off, of course, but they do still steadily decline. In the case of Gran Turismo 7, the latest entry in Polyphony Digital's smash hit sim racer series, it's defying these traditional industry expectations. Speaking at the Gran Turismo World Series 2025 World Finals in Fukuoka earlier today, series boss Kazunori Yamauchi revealed the game is drawing an incredible 2 million monthly active users right now, and new players are joining all the time. So look, everyone's going to have their feelings about, Gran Turismo, and of course the old saw is Gran Turismo versus Forza. I don't really care about that. I play both games. I enjoy both for the things that both do well. And when I talk about Forza, I mean both Forza Motorsport and Forza Horizon, which are distinctly different games. I have never been a super huge fan of the campaign structure and framework of Gran Turismo. For people who listen to me, I play a lot of racing games. One of my huge basic tentpole philosophies is racing games should not put a lot of things in your windshield. And that my the spiritual pureness of a racing game is just give me a bunch of cars, give me a bunch of tracks, give me some of those that I have to do unlocks of, and then just turn me loose and let me go racing. Tuning is fine. I like having a variety of games that you both get under the hood and games that you don't. What I'm not a super huge fan of is things that put, for F1 series by Codemasters now has its like story driven mode. And there are some positives for that. I'm not entirely negative on that, but like that's a thing where like if I was forced to do that, I would be really cranky. And I think the very first year they did that, I think you were forced to do it. And then after that, they give you an option to do the story driven versus just a regular campaign. And so Gran Turismo with like the licenses and later in Gran Turismo 7, like going to the cafe to get like the missions from the dude. Like I'm not hating on that, but like I'm not a super huge fan of it. Like I prefer kind of like the Need for Speed structure a little bit where like you just pick a race. Even in the days where you go back to like Hot Pursuit 2, where it's not even open world, where you just go to a map, pick a race, hit a button, and like you show up at the race, right? And you go. So there's elements of Gran Turismo 7's campaign framework that I haven't particularly cared for. That being said, and then we've had some Gran Turismo whiffs, like the whole thing. I think it was Gran Turismo 6 that like came out on the PlayStation 3 like a week after the PlayStation 4 launched. The whole Gran Turismo Sport thing, we've had issues. And I'm not the diehard Gran Turismo fan that like some other friends and content creators that I know are. That being said, Gran Turismo 7 apparently appears to be doing what it needs to do. It's moved significant numbers on the PlayStation platform. It is a game that, although it came out relatively early in the PlayStation 5 life cycle, it continues to bring people back, as this article is saying. Of course, the recent drop of, I think it's called the Spec 3 release pack, which I haven't gotten into yet, has obviously brought players back. But this is a thing that does the thing for PlayStation in terms of a software portfolio, a game portfolio, an IP portfolio. That is exactly the type of thing that PlayStation needs. I've also been very technically impressed with what they've done with Gran Turismo. I love the fact it's remarkable to me that this thing has all of the different render modes and image quality modes and performance modes that it has. All the way from 1080p 1080p 60 all the way up to 4K 60 with iterations of 120 in between, the support for 1440p resolutions with both performance and quality modes. It's really impressive what they've done with this title. And even though, like I said, I'm not as huge of a Gran Turismo 7 fan as lots of my friends are, it is a game that I keep installed on my PlayStation 5 and I do go back to quite frequently. So last news story is, let's see if we can get this into reader mode also, is the article that I mentioned over on Vortex. Colorful globally launches iGame GeForce RTX 50 Mini Overclock Series graphics cards white version leaked. this is the other story that I mentioned in the intro, so I do want to at least cover it before we get out of here. Colorful announces the global launch of the highly anticipated iGame GeForce RTX 50 Mini OC series graphics cards designed for compact PCs and small form factor PCs. The iGame GeForce RTX 50 Mini OC graphics cards measure only 180 millimeters in length. The series makes its debut with the iGame GeForce RTX 5060 Ti Mini Overclock 8GB, delivering powerful next-generation performance and a refined, space-saving design. The iGame RTX 5060 Ti Mini Overclock 16GB and iGame RTX 5070 Mini Overclock 12GB will be launched at a later date. Now, these cards are a little too small form factor for me. I'm probably never going to do any build with a single fan assembly. I do like dual fan assemblies. Two of my rigs now have from MSI two RTX 4070 Supers in it that are two fan. And yes, I love the fact that, when I'm in that upgrade cycle, I'm picking a card where now I don't have to be worried about, as I was talking to Brap yesterday, I don't have to be worried about, my 360 millimeter AIO radiator is mounted in the front of my case. Do I have enough clearance, right, for this card that I'm bringing in to fit without bumping up against the radiator? So what I like about these isn't so much that the single fan cards are coming out, but that we should hopefully now start seeing more dual fan card designs coming out, which I think will be great for regular enthusiasts. So what I also found interesting was, as far as I know, Colorful is typically a Radeon vendor. I don't know if they've done GeForce and NVIDIA cards before. I'm sure that they have at some point, but they're not really known, at least in the circles that I run in, as like a major go-to name for an AIB vendor. So it's interesting that they're doing this. I wonder if this is a step out and a branch out from their association with AMD, given the way that the market is looking. But either way, I think this is a good product in terms of providing variation in designs and vendors that are available, as we should know from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, although typically gamers seem to choose to cherry pick when they choose to forget these rules. But, things are better for buyers when there are more suppliers on the market and you have more choice. So with these choices coming into the fore, both with a vendor, and if Colorful has been around doing RTX cards and it's not a vendor plus one, then fine. At least the variance in the additional designs and product, I think, will overall be good for buyers. All right, so thanks so much today for everybody who happens to swing by and listen to this this solo cast on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. Once again, my name has been Game Logic. So we'll be doing these in this format probably for the remainder of 2026 is what I'm looking forward to doing, this kind of segments where I record a little bit daily and then post it in a wrap up and try and get it out every few days. So we'll see how long I'm able to stick with that. But until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, play the games that you like, come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.